Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's session, the International Panel on Decolonizing Community-based Research. It's our fifth webinar in our six-part online learning and discussion series on decolonizing community-based research that's been taking place over this winter and spring 2021 and hosted by Community-based Research Canada. So my name is Julia Coburn. I'm the CBRCanada Program Coordinator, and happy to have everybody here today for today's session. First, before we get started, it's important to acknowledge that the CBRCanada Secretariat is situated on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. In the spirit of reconciliation, CBRCanada is committed to engaging with and learning from diverse Indigenous peoples and communities across Canada, as well as addressing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And I have a couple of calls to action up here that felt relevant to today. A little bit about CBRCanada. Our mission is to advance community-based research excellence in Canada by strengthening partnerships, bridging capacity, mobilizing knowledge, and championing CBR among individuals, communities, and institutions. For 10 years, CBRCanada has brought together key players of community campus partnerships. And just so everybody is aware, this webinar is being recorded, so if you'd like to refer back to it later or share it with others, you can go to the communityresearchcanada.ca website and find it under webinars and discussions. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our wonderful facilitators for today's session, Crystal Tremblay and Peter Taylor. So Crystal Tremblay is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and academic specialist in community engaged research at the University of Victoria. She is the academic lead of the Salish Sea Hub and initiative of the Unesco Chair in Community-Based Research Knowledge for Change Global Consortium, and is also a board member of Community-Based Research Canada. And we also have Dr. Peter Taylor, and he is the Director of Research at the Institute of Development Studies in UK. Previously, he was the Director of Strategic Development at IDRC Canada, where he also led the think tank initiative supporting policy research organizations in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. So Crystal and Peter, I'm going to let you take over from here to introduce our wonderful panelists and how this session is going to work today.
Great, thanks so much, Julia, and welcome everyone and our panelists. I'm so pleased to be here. As Julia mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria. I'm a visitor to these territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and the Sanic First Nations. I've been a visitor here for about 17 years. Very grateful and feel a very strong sense of accountability as a steward to these lands and waters, and to honor the relationships of the First Peoples, past and present, to these territories. So I'm really excited to be part of this series with my co-chair, Peter Taylor, who I'll introduce in a moment. Today's webinar brings together three really amazing speakers from around the world, and I'll introduce them in more detail shortly. To really talk about their personal experiences on what it means to decolonize community-based research. And what are we really talking about when we speak of decolonizing research and coloniality? What difference are we trying to make acknowledging these ongoing violence and perpetuation, and in raising consciousness and challenging ourselves and others to feel this discomfort? What does this all really mean as individuals and in our work and for our world? Because our knowledges will be different based on who we are and where we come from, our experience, our context, our privilege, our personal experiences is such a powerful force in this arena. One of the initiatives that I've been really inspired by and involved in is the Unesco Chair in Community-Based Research Knowledge for Change Global Consortium. Actually, I've met two of our speakers today through this network, which I'm really grateful for. One of the hubs, there's over 20 emerging hubs around the world. One of them, the Salish Sea Hub, actually, located here where I am, are really trying to bring research out of the university, driven by community needs, and focused on decolonizing knowledge, focused on advancing a pluralistic society. So it's such a pleasure to be part of this network, this growing network, and to introduce our speakers today, who I know will have lots of very exciting things to share with us as we all think about what this means for us personally and for our work. And I'm so pleased also to co-host this session with my colleague, Peter Taylor from the Institute of Development Studies from Sussex University. We've been co-chairing the social divide stream of the Victoria Forum for almost 2 years now, Peter, because we've had some longer delays. And we've been convening a number of webinars on this topic of decolonizing knowledge. So I'll pass it on to you, Peter, just to say a few words before I introduce our speakers.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. And I'm just really pleased we're able to have this conversation today on such an important topic. And I'm also very happy to be participating with such amazing speakers who you're going to hear about shortly, and also with participants on this call who I know have such wide-ranging experience as well. And I just wanted to say thanks particularly to CBRCanada and especially to Julia, who has been fabulous in helping us to bring all of this together today. So I think, why are we having this conversation? Well, because in many ways and in many countries, we're witnessing greater social divides driven by race, gender, class, and financial inequities. And we've seen powerful evidence of these brought into sharp focus over the last 2 years by the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. Through 2020, we've seen how the pandemic has actually exacerbated existing inequalities, and it's having the greatest impacts where social divides are the greatest. And that's very much the backdrop to the conversation that Crystal just mentioned at the Victoria Forum. And I'm sure that many on this call are joining because you're already part of conversations like this. In fact, these are not new conversations. And we're exploring this at IDS where I work because we are a UK-based organization that works on global challenges. And so we realize we need to find ways to decolonize the research we do, our curricula, our learning and teaching, our institutional culture and life, and also the relationships that we have with a wide diversity of partners and collaborators. And these conversations are very active. In fact, just a few hours ago, I was involved in another webinar within a group we call the COVID Collective, which is a group of research members, which actually includes Danilo, who's going to speak shortly, who are actively looking to find ways of doing research together better. And that collective view, which is inclusive, accounts for diversity, and really tries to address the challenge of working with different kinds of knowledge. Because I think one of the key challenges that we recognize is that as human beings, unfortunately, we often don't recognize or value knowledge which is needed to address the challenges that we face simply because of where it resides or who has generated it. And we know that there's no one way of knowing. We know that wisdom exists in every community. So decolonize knowledge, we're thinking about how we recognize people as knowers of their experience, how we weave together knowledge from different sources, including from Indigenous and local knowledge systems, which is an important point for this series that CBRCanada has been organizing. And at IDS, we're very concerned about how narratives are created by bringing together multiple perspectives and different kinds and expressions of knowledge, and also working in inclusive and participatory ways. And in the session that we had earlier today, a lot of very interesting reflections, which actually to some extent mirrored some ideas that Crystal and I put in a blog. And I'll just put the link in the chat if anyone is interested to look at it. But in that, we really just tried to highlight some of the things that we heard in other spaces that people are also raising around this about, for example, ensuring that solutions are shaped and created by those who are actually experiencing the challenges. Is establishing reflective spaces, taking account of power and privilege. Something that came up today was a huge emphasis on trust. In research processes, trust is very hard to build, but it's very easily lost. So are we really bringing the requirements that as researchers we need into these different spaces, and also acknowledging the incredible gifts that participants in research make of time, energy, belief, and sometimes even personal risk. So how do we ensure that we're really addressing the way we do research equitably in transparent ways, and giving the time and the patience and often the humility to being able to find ways of working. Finally, just before I give back to Crystal, the other thing I'm often reminded of is that in the end, this is a personal conversation. I'm sure our speakers are going to talk about this as well. And I anticipate today, at times there may be moments where we feel a bit uncomfortable. And actually, I hope so, because it's often those moments that present us with the most powerful opportunities to learn. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the conversation unfold. Crystal, back to you.
Thanks so much, Peter. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our wonderful speakers today. We have Dr. Catherine Hoppers, serves as an expert to Unesco, the World Economic Forum, and the World Intellectual Property Organization on Traditional Knowledge and Community Intellectual Property Rights. She held a South African Research Chair in Development Education, hosted at the University of South Africa, Pretoria. Prior to that, Catherine was a technical advisor on Indigenous knowledge systems to the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Arts, Culture, Science, and Technology in South Africa, and led the task team to draft the national policy on Indigenous knowledge systems. Nkatha Mercy, a Kenyan, is a geography PhD candidate at West Virginia University and co-chair of the Nyeri Knowledge for Change UNESCO Hub based in Arusha, Tanzania. As a Vlira Uo Scholar and an Erasmus Lifelong Fellow, Nkatha's research interests straddle environment and governance and are guided by concepts of capabilities and knowledge democracies. She seeks ways in which geotechnological skills and data can be used by communities and governments at the subnational level to enhance environmental governance towards the realization of sustainable development. And finally, Danilo Paivo Ramos is a professor in the Department of Anthropology and Ethnology and in the Anthropology Graduate Program at the Federal University of Bahia in Salvador, Brazil. He is also coordinator of the Ethnology, Linguistics, and Indigenous Health Research Group and member of the Associación Saúde Sem Limites, Health Unlimited NGO. He collaborates with the Hukta people and with the Rio Negro Indigenous Organizations Federation in actions aimed at Indigenous health, shamanism, verbal art and communication, and Indigenous land self-management. Wow, we have an amazing lineup today. I'm so thrilled you're all here to join us. So just a little bit about how this session will work today. It's a little bit different than the previous webinars. So we've invited each panelist to share about 10 minutes of their personal thoughts and perspectives on decolonizing community-based research. And then after, we invited them to reflect on some of the insights and ideas that have been brought up from some of the other panelists. We won't be having a formal Q&A today, but we will be following up next week to talk about some of these big ideas that were generated. So we do hope you join us next week to come back to sit with some of these ideas and have some further conversations about this. So I invite you, Catherine, now to take the stage.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. I'll go straight to the point. A good prognosis depends on a good diagnosis. In order to decolonize something, you have to face the elephant in the room. You have to spell clearly what colonialism has meant for you. You have to be clear for yourself first before you go out and save people. So in a way, colonization and the decolonization efforts I'm hearing of all over the world seems to me to, you have heard of the 6 blind men and the elephant. and one held the tail and said, oh, the elephant is like a snake. One held the ears. Oh, the elephant flap is like whatever. One held the leg. Oh, the elephant is like a trunk, and so on and so forth. But do we actually know what colonialism is and how it has affected people? The dehumanization it has created. And just to shock you a bit, I'll read a line from John Ralston Saul in his book, The Comeback. He writes how the prevailing and dominating worldviews that surround us today and which we are all compelled to respond to is one that is narrow in its visions, exclusive and detached in relating to the total environment, analytical and deductive in its perception and thinking, linear in its doing, hierarchical and competitive in its management of fields of activity. Colonialism remains a factor to us in that it provided the framework for the organized subjugation of the cultural, scientific, and economic life of many in Africa and throughout in the indigenous communities worldwide. This subjugation extended in a spectrum from people's ways of seeing, their ways of being, their ways of negotiating life processes in different environments, their survival techniques, to technologies for ecologically sensitive exploitation of natural resources. All the knowledges which the indigenous people had were en masse rendered irrelevant to their use, as millions of people became transmogrified by the combined advent of modern science and colonialism into an inverted mirror of Western identity, a mirror that belittled them and sent them to the back of the queue. Now, I will shift from analyzing colonialism to the universities that house us, that gives us bread, and which feeds us. You know, we have to recognize that university communities, including all of us, are more closed loops of discourse than we imagine. Generally speaking, it is the university itself that decides on the quality, usefulness, integrity of its service, not the communities that are being served, really. The university controls the discourse from start to finish. Goals, research methods, community practical applications, and right up to the assessment itself. So, we want to decolonize, really? Are we joking? Are we really joking? A third point in conclusion, which I would like to raise, is that for Africans, it is strongly felt that the time has come to subject to direct interrogation the historical, scientific, and colonial discourses behind the semantic shift that turn the illiterate from someone who is ignorant of the alphabet to a complete ignorant. Really, this is not funny. This is not funny. Pitting what is not written as thoughtless, as a weakness, and at its limit as primitivism, which has been central to the strategic disempowerment of African societies. Now, how are we handling this community-based research? Which part of the elephant are we handling? Is it the tail? Is it the ears? Is it the trunk? What do we mean by decolonizing community-based research, really? I end here. Okay.
Thank you, Kathy. Mikatha?
Right, so this is me setting my timer in respect of the 10 minutes. So thank you very much. It's a joy to have Dr. Hoppers go before me. And it's also a challenge to have Dr. Hoppers go before me. So I seek to speak to decolonizing community-based research in the context of Indigenous knowledge and sustainable development. And so perhaps picking up from where Dr. Hoppers has left off is to say that I have had it said that we seem to be at present within another decolonization time. This in a political and intellectual tradition of inquiry that runs back over a century in my particular continent. So I approach this conversation with a deep-seated respect for those that have opened my eyes to this contestation of who can legitimately know and produce useful knowledge. I sit at the feet of those that continue to labor in this still largely peripheral space of decolonial theory and praxis. In this conversation, I use decolonization understood from Mbembe's entanglement perspective, in which colonization was in many regards a co-production of colonizers and colonized, so that as Sabelo says, decolonization has to remain a revolutionary term with theoretical and practical value, and a concept that speaks about rehumanization itself, a fundamental planetary project. So I begin by acknowledging that my being here is a function of opportunities availed to me by, among others, Ezra Mbogari, who is former principal at the MS Training Center for Development Cooperation in Arusha, Tanzania, as well as, of course, Drs. Rajesh Tandon and Bard Hall, who are my mentors and Unesco co-chairs in CBPR. As has been mentioned, I belong to the Knowledge for Change Hub. It's part of the Unesco K4C Global Consortium. Together, we are looking to focus on the advancement of community-based research as part of our contribution towards attainment of sustainable development goals. So broadly, as a hub, we are looking to contribute to SDG 2, which has to do with zero hunger. We are looking to contribute to SDG 5, which has to do with gender equality. We're also looking to contribute to SDG 13, which is climate action. and tangentially to SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions within, of course, which the preceding SDGs would function. So I shall speak and address myself to the dilemma of decolonizing community-based research in the context of calls for inculcation of Indigenous knowledge in their attainment. I shall draw briefly from a research experience which we conducted with the Chamwino community of women in Dodoma, Tanzania in 2019 when people could still travel. The 2030 agenda for sustainable development is broad. It's a broad policy framework. It has 17 sustainable development goals and 169 associated targets. And they're described as integrated and indivisible. So the promise of this agenda is to leave no one behind and to reach the farthest first. It is perhaps in view of this promise and the historical leaving behind of knowledge systems known as Indigenous and traditional, that the goals make explicit mention of Indigenous people all of 2 times within the framework itself and 4 times in its 169 indicator list. So not surprisingly, the first mention of Indigenous people is made in Goal 2 in relation to land, doubling agricultural productivity and the incomes of low-scale food producers. Indigenous people here are mentioned alongside women, farmers, pastoralists, and fishers. They appear again in Goal 4, which lends itself to inclusive quality education and elimination of gender disparities. In view of this, and working as we do, as Nyerere Hub with so-called Indigenous communities, it is our intention as a hub to critically interrogate epistemological and ontological orientation when it comes to our community-university research relationship. And we find that this interrogation is key because university research is generally undergirded by, as Dr. Hoppers has said, a dominant way of knowing and a dominant way of being that in turn advises research methods and tools that in turn advises our relevance in the interface between higher education, science, and policymaking. And this insofar as they offer community-led and community-driven sustainable outcomes. So as earlier mentioned, one of our primary SDGs of focus is zero hunger and or food security. And this is how we found ourselves in Chamwino, in Dodoma. It's a semi-arid region with a population of about 2 million, where women slightly outnumber men. So arid and semi-arid regions like Chamwino form a unique part of lands and ecosystems that globally are home to about 80% of the world's food, seed, and animal genetic biodiversity. They also sequester carbon, a key thing when it comes to global warming. And so contrary to their framing as vulnerable, arid and semi-arid lands are incredibly strong and enduring environments. And this endurance derives from community livelihood practices embedded in community languages that allow for sustainable livelihood support practices. Their resistance to modernization is how these knowledge systems earn their tag as traditional and indigenous knowledge, even as the modernized world now increasingly is turning to their knowledge systems for sustainable development. Critical to note is that the SDGs are intensively data-driven. They elevate the centrality of metrics. They frame development challenges as technical and thereby situate the power to address them in field knowledge experts who can measure and evaluate according to set parameters. And it is here where the hinge of our dilemma swings when, as a hub of community-based participatory researchers, we set out for research. So based on our Chamwino experience, I have about 3 points of reflection from engaging with a community of women with regard to SDG 2, zero hunger and or food security. One, we found that it is possible to have participatory methods that are not necessarily decolonized methods, and therefore still conduct not so decolonized research. So let me try and demonstrate how this reflection came about. Time is a key factor in establishing a trusting relationship with people that one wants to co-construct knowledge with. And time within higher education institutions and academia is something that we do not seem to have. It is premised on the research, the structural setup of research and research funding. And so we rely on established partnerships for entry into communities. So in our case, in Chamwino, we leveraged one of our partners' existing relationship. They were working on a project on public financing on agriculture. So it is here then that several questions present themselves. Public financing on agriculture as an ongoing project by our partner had preset goals and intended outcomes in its design process. So while we use participatory methodologies for this particular exercise, the question is, how might the project design have influenced who was in the room before we got into the room? Who did it leave out in its efforts at delivering what that particular project would consider successful outcomes? Who were and or what were the project's gatekeeping and power dynamics at play before we got there? The second point of reflection based on our conversation in Chamwino was and has to do with how SDGs are structured and the elevation of metrics in order to produce the kind of data that they are asking for, and in order to measure achievement of targets in the language and the framing that the SDGs present us with, one must of necessity be driven by a very specific epistemological and ontological orientation of what counts as development, whether that development is sustainable or otherwise. And so for the most part, I think as Dr. Hoppers has said, Indigenous knowledge has a tendency to incorporate a very holistic, biocentric understanding of the planet that centers the earth, the living, non-living, alongside the spiritual. This knowledge is itself embedded in language and naming so that the outcomes of such a thought process around development might look a bit different than what our English research project report looked like after our CBPR exercise in Chamwino. And then lastly, women in development and the SDGs. So I shall make a very broad claim here, very, very carefully, which is that the principal ways in which feminists theorize and therefore research gender has largely failed to travel in my continent. Amina Mamad notes that the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Dr. Kofi Annan, once observed that the face of poverty in Africa is that of women. Dr. Oyewumi speaks to the artificial marginalization of the universal African woman that is often blamed on African cultures. And then Dr. Nkiru asserts that if the sociopolitical reality of gender and development is constructed out of the same precepts underlying colonialism, modernity, and capitalism, which it seems that the SDGs framework is premised on, implicit in these structures is an ontology of subjugation and identities that are in opposition categories, dualities, discourses that assign and articulate private and public spheres, which is not necessarily how food production is done in Chamwino, for instance. So in order for women to produce food, they must and they do concern themselves with other environmental considerations that lend themselves to successful food production. You're looking at food in relation to water, food in relation to forest conservation, food in relation to plant species that allow for household food nutrition and diversification across different seasons, foods that heal, and all of that. So that these are fluid processes that flow back and forth between men and women, depending on context, culture, geography, occupation, etc. And this lens of seeing an African woman as a knower, a producer, and a purveyor of knowledge hasn't quite taken root yet. And so as things stand, the universal African woman still needs empowerment. But then I want to invite us to sit with a moment with Dr. Asi Lumumba's statement that if agricultural production as a function of the education system was to reflect the cosmology of most African cultural food production systems, the field of agricultural engineering would be predominantly female. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Nkatha. Lots of very insightful things to digest already. And I'll invite Danilo to join us.
Thank you very much. Just say hi to Catherine and to Mercy. And so I think that I want to share something. I don't know if you are seeing now. So it's nice to be here to dialogical exercise of a critical epistemology on decolonizing actions. For me, it's just to start. I am speaking as an anthropologist, but as a professor as well of Indigenous students at the university. I am speaking as an interlocutor of lots of shamans within the Alto Rio Negro region. And I think that it's very important to positionate myself in this context of increasing necropolitics in my country and genocide actions in my country as an interlocutor and as well as a multiple person inhabited by multiple voices, the voices of my Indigenous students, the voice of Indigenous professionals that I keep in touch and I keep exchanging points of view. So I am inhabited by all these voices and by all their critical perspectives. And I am inhabited by all the cosmological critical, by the cosmopolitics of meanings of this critical, by spirits, by my dreams and other dreams. And so that's where I think that I must situate myself to dialogue with you today. And so I will show something of our effort in the last 20 years in this region, in this Amazonian region. And I will share something about our recent effort to create an autonomous action and health in the Alto Rio Negro region, facing the state genocide that is increasing in our country. So I will speak to you about our collective initiative, and it's collective in a very large sense. You can see that it involves lots of health professionals, Indigenous leaders, Indigenous professionals, and anthropologists, students as well in different state levels and different community levels as well. So I am trying to speak about all our lessons as a collective group which take part Indigenous leaders, indigenous movements of this region in Brazil, and health professionals, students, and university professors as well. So I'm part of the Brazilian Initiative. I've been part of the Inequal Voices study in 2017 and 2018. And these days we are developing the intercultural communication project for an effective COVID-19 response in Amazonian indigenous territories. So this is a very large region, and it's a very vast territory with 22 different ethnic groups and with 22 different languages. You can figure out how difficult it could be to communicate in health in a very intercultural environment and within a very intercultural communicative environment. So it's a very high sophisticated system of interethnic political relations centered on the ritual complex of Jurupari. It's an initiation ritual for young boys, and the Dabukuri, that is an exchange ritual for different ethnic groups. It's a highly intensively hierarchical political culture and asymmetrical exchange with asymmetrical exchange relations within the indigenous different ethnic groups and with them to the non-indigenous population of this region. So it's a unique regional indigenous movement. There's a unique regional indigenous movement, the FOIN, the Alto Rio Negro Indigenous Federation, and they are active since 1987. So I took part of all these indigenous movements initiatives since 2007 as part of the Health Unlimited, the Associação Saúde Sem Limites NGO, and also as part of the CAPI, the Collective for Support Recent Contact Indigenous Peoples and Isolated Peoples in this region. So you can figure out how complex is this context. The communities are like 3 days far from the town center in a boat, and the inequalities are very huge and very deep. Now we have terrible taxes of children malnutrition, for example, suicides, and other things like malaria, very hard epidemiologic situations. And so it's very important to think deeply about what is critical interculturality in health. So it's been very, very important that indigenous leaders like Marcelino, who is a friend of me, to lead the initiatives. And so in this picture, he's working with a group of indigenous counselors and trying to discuss social control and in indigenous health. So in this region. We have 34 indigenous health districts. In Brazil, we have 34 indigenous health district councils with 1,390 indigenous councillors. And the national representative council was blocked by Bolsonaro, our president, in the past few years. And so it's very, very important for us to work with the indigenous health system, indigenous traditional health systems, and it's very important for us to do a very deep research on shamanism, enchantments, ethnopharmacology, and to dialogue, to create a very deep dialogue with old men and the owners of all these very complex healing systems. And so just quickly, we developed very important initiatives that was the Unequal Voices study in partnership with the Nueti NGO from Mozambique. And we discussed all the lessons during in developing these different initiatives to improve the participation of indigenous counselors in health policies. So you can see some of the moments of all our efforts. So visiting each community, listening to each counselor, to each indigenous agent, to each woman, to each professor, and so to each indigenous and non-indigenous health professional, to doing focus group research. And so it was a very, very important experience. And so some of our lessons, indigenous movements, letters, denouncing problems and demanding government interventions were very, very important to take into account. To do action research on quality of indigenous health services, to have their own data, apart from the official and governmental manipulated data. Indigenous health agents and counselors' engagement in community and regional councils for the social accountability was very, very important. To do serious work on indigenous medicine and shamanism, and working both ways with health counselors focused on multiple levels and justice and political systems focused on strategies to claim health rights. And so now we are developing this initiative to improve intercultural communication for an effective response to COVID in this region. And we are led by Domingos Barreto, that is a very important indigenous leader. And all our research team is composed by indigenous leaders from different ethnic groups. And so it makes a lot of difference. And other thing that makes a deep difference is to include indigenous health professionals, indigenous anthropologists, and them having a very, very first place in all these initiatives. So thank you very much. We can keep dialoguing.
Thanks so much, Danilo. I'll jump in now and just to facilitate a little bit of a conversation amongst our speakers, because I think just listening to all of the examples, there are quite strong differences between what everyone has spoken about, but also some strands, I think, which really bind interest and experience together. So I just want to go back to Catherine. You raised at the moment this idea of an elephant. And depending on which part of the elephant we engage with, we might respond differently, because that's the piece that we're actually looking at. In your presentation, you reminded us that decolonization is an experience of subjugation and violence that continues, and in some ways is maintained and propagated by the kind of context in which we work, in university context, for example. Nkata, you talked about dominant development paradigms, including the SDGs, which in many ways are supposed to leave no one behind, reach the furthest behind first, and yet, as you illustrated, out of that huge number of goals and indicators and targets, Indigenous peoples are mentioned only 4 times, which suggests that it's very challenging to grapple with that particular part of the elephant. And Danilo, you have illustrated through a really amazing example of the work you're engaged in a very contested environment in Brazil, how you're actually working with different forms of knowledge, with peoples and communities who themselves are extremely diverse, and yet somehow translating that into actions which are part of a struggle, a wider struggle, which is partly a political struggle and a struggle against power. So I think we're seeing different parts of a very large elephant. And I wonder, Catherine, if I could come back to you first. Now we've heard all the 3 presentations, including your own. Where do you feel we should, or we could be, placing some of our emphasis if we want to continue this dialogue in a meaningful and a useful way?
First of all, the recognition that we are only focused on one part of the elephant is a fundamental, at least, relief, because just like a meeting under COVID, I mean, it is beginning to sound like a bandwagon, really. Oh, COVID, oh, COVID, oh, we are blaming COVID for everything. But, you know, just to be honest to ourselves, that, you know, we are just singling out a tiny piece of colonialism, really. But we have to understand the basic cultural structures that have determined colonialism and pierce it at that. I mean, it is not a joke. It really to be human, where inhumanity has been the norm. It is a real. You have to be an ethical warrior. You just don't be a researcher. No, because it is a very, very, it is almost a life and death issue. People are suffering. People have been humiliated constantly by our institutions, by our policies, and so on and so forth. So admission that we are only focusing on a little bit of that evil, at least is a generous admission. But to talk of decolonizing, when we are just doing community-based research, this is useless, really. But if we admit that we are only, we are only dealing with the small parts of it, while we invest in understanding the phenomenon and the basic cultural structures of colonialism, and we can merge what we are doing with that deep endeavor. At least I think that we can go some distance. For example, Danilo is working towards an intercultural debate. That is what Unesco has been searching for. That modern science does not constitute the only form of knowledge. We have to admit it publicly without duress. So promoting intercultural debates towards equitable validation, for example, combining cultural justice, functional tolerance, and social cohesion worldwide is also another effort to pierce into the discourse of colonialism so that we can weaken it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. You're challenging us, but I think you're also giving us hope. And Catherine, let me come to you, and I'm just conscious that time will defeat us before too long. So, Catherine, if I can get your response really on anything that's been touched on, and then Danilo, I'll come back to you as well.
Right. So I think just to build on what Dr. Hoppers has said, which is that for us to do decolonization, we have to do more than just, methodological reorientation, because decolonization, as had said, needs to remain a revolutionary concept in which we are talking about rehumanization, and we're talking about rehumanization because the colonial project assumes that only some people are human enough to produce knowledge, are human enough to understand, and are human enough to therefore be the purveyors of what knowledge is. And so in that context, then, if we consider the concept of knowledge democracy, that indeed, yes, there's other people out there and they have other ways of knowing, and that these other ways of knowing actually count, then perhaps we begin to arrive at research that engenders itself to actual development and actual transformation. So I think this is what I would have to say.
Thank you, Nkata. And Danilo, I'll just come to you for a final reflection. And there's also a question that someone has asked about how much political support there is from Brazil's states or municipal representatives for the work you do. Are you working with the political stream or against it?
We are facing this time the very militarization of indigenous health in Brazil and of indigenous policies in general. So that's why it's been very, very difficult. And the government is blocking all the international cooperation and the partnerships with universities, the partnerships between indigenous, governmental indigenous health institution and our public universities. So they are trying to block all these initiatives. So I presented something that is being highly subversive, and we are building this really as a way to face and to confront, to act against this necropolicy and this genocide situation that we are facing within Brazil. So I think that it can answer a little. But in your question, Peter, I think that it's very important to take into account in every project, in every initiative that is aiming to decolonize health, decolonize epistemologies, decolonize. It's very, very important to understand deeply the complexity of all power relations in context. So, because if I am working just in partnership with, for example, with Tucano people, ethnic group in Brazil, I can disconsider the point of view and the violence that recent contacted people are facing with, and this might not be considered by Tucano people. So it's very, very important to understand the complexity of interethnic relations, the complexity of asymmetrical relations, and to positionate ourselves to dialogue and to try to looking for together for more imbalancement and for to reduce inequalities in health, in education, in human rights, effectivation in orphans. So just to contribute a little.
Thank you, Danilo. Thanks so much. And the good news is that next week, this conversation will be able to continue with all those who will be able to come back and join us. So let me hand back to Crystal now to perhaps bring us towards the end with some closing words for this week.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you so much, Catherine, Katha, and Danilo, for just giving us such a good and thoughtful start to this week, but also for us to think and take away a lot of these ideas personally, but also within our institutions and structures that we live in. So I'm just so grateful for all of your words today, for your presence and all the work that you do, and grateful for everyone here to have attended today. And we hope that you all come back next week so that we can engage further on this topic. And thank you so much for Julia and CBRCanada for hosting us today.
Yes, thank you again to our facilitators, to Crystal and Peter, to our wonderful panelists, Catherine and Katha and Danilo, and to all of you for just a wonderful and deep and meaningful dialogue that we had today. As Crystal mentioned, we have a discussion that's going to be following up, and all of you will be able to engage in a discussion together in small groups. If you'd like to join it, you can see how to register. It's communityresearchcanada.ca/events. And thank you. We look forward to seeing everybody next week. Bye for now.
Bye. Thank you.